the HOA president, Patricia Harrington, who boldly built her mansion on my family's Lakefront ranch that we've legally owned for 3 generations. She believed a few HOA bylaws could crush any inheritance papers. But there's one thing Patricia didn't. No, I'm holding something that when revealed at the right moment will make the entire courtroom turn around in a split second. Beckos what I discovered afterward will make you question everything you've ever believed about the people who manage residential community. And 5 minutes later, Patricia was standing in the middle of the courtroom crying, "Tough judge, that land destroyed my life." Comment below where you're watching this story from, because the truth is just beginning to unfold. Let me paint you a picture of Lakeside Estates first. It's one of those upscale communities where every lawn looks like it belongs in a magazine, where the houses cost more than most people make in a decade, and where the HOA rules are thicker than a phone book, the kind of place where you get fined for having through a shade of beige on your mailbox. My family's ranch sits right on the prime lakefront property, a sprawling piece of land that my grandfather bought back in 1962, when this whole area was just farmland and dreams. 3 generations of Thompsons have called this place home, and I'll be damned if some power-hungry HOA queen is going to change that. My name is Marcus Thompson, and I'm a 38-year-old environmental engineer who inherited this beautiful Lakefront ranch from my grandfather 2 years ago. The property spans 15 acres of pristine land with direct lake access, old-growth oak trees, and a charming farmhouse that my grandfather built with his own hands. It's the kind-of place where you can still hear the loons calling across the water at dawn and watch the sunset paint the sky in colors that no Instagram filter could ever capture. This land isn't just property to me. It's my family's legacy. My connection to something bigger than myself, and apparently Patricia Harrington's next conquest. Patricia, or us, I like to call her, the Iron Lady, is a 52-year-old retired lawyer who became a wealthy widow 3 years ago when her husband mysteriously disappeared on what she called an extended European vacation. She moved to Lakeside Estates 4 years ago and immediately ran for HOA president, winning by a landslide because, frankly, nobody else wanted to deal with the headache. What started as typical HOA nitpicking about trash can placement and lawn height quickly escalated into something resembling a totalitarian regime. Patricia doesn't just enforce rules, she creates them, bends them, and uses them like weapons against anyone who dares to question her authority. The trouble started on a Tuesday morning in March when I woke up to the sound of heavy machinery rumbling across my property. I stumbled out of bed, threw on some clothes, and walked outside to find a crew of construction workers setting up equipment on the eastern edge of my land, right where the property slopes down toward the lake, the most beautiful spot on the entire ranch, and they were preparing to dig it up. When I approached the foreman, a burly guy named Rodriguez, who looked as confused as I felt, he handed me a work order signed by none other than Patricia Harrington, authorizing the construction of a luxury lakefront residence on with paperwork labeled as HOA Community Property Zone 7B. I marched straight to Patricia's house, a gaudy McMansion that she'd painted an obnoxious shade of salmon pink because, according to her, it reminded her of her Mediterranean heritage. I found her standing in her front yard wearing what I swear was a plastic tiara, directing her landscapers like she was commanding an army. When I confronted her about the construction on me land, she didn't even have the decency to look surprised. Instead, she smiled that cold, calculating smile that Ty would come to know and hate, and calmly informed me that according to Bylaw 23C, all lakefront property within the Lakeside Estates community boundaries fell under HOA management and development authority. "Mr. Thompson," she said, adjusting her ridiculous tiara, "perhaps you should familiarize yourself with the community regulations before making accusations. This land has been designated for community enhancement, and my new residence will significantly increase property values for everyone." The way she said everyone made it clear that she meant everyone except me. When E pointed out that my family had owned this land since before the HOA even existed, she reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a manila folder containing what she claimed was a copy of a voluntary land transfer agreement stupidly signed by my grandfather in 1987, granting the future HOA development rights to the lakefront, a portion of the property. I stared at that document, reading my grandfather's name in what looked like his handwriting, feeling the ground shift beneath my feet. This was impossible. Grandpa Thompson was the most meticulous man I'd ever known when it came to legal documents and property rights. He kept copies of everything, filed every paper and triplicate, and never ever would have signed away the most valuable part of our family land. But there it was, in black and white, dated and notarized, looking official enough to fool a judge. Patricia watched me confusion with obvious satisfaction, tapping her manicured nails against the folder like she was drumming out a victory march. "I understand this must come as a shock," she continued, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "But legal documents don't lie. Mr. Thompson, my construction begins tomorrow, and I'd appreciate it if you'd keep your concerns to yourself. We wouldn't want to upset the other residents with unnecessary drama." The threat in her voice was subtle, but unmistakable. Cross Patricia Harrington, and life in Lakeside Estates would become very uncomfortable very quickly. As I walked away from her house, my mind racing with questions and my hands shaking with anger, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was missing something important, something that would change everything. But there was one thing Patricia didn't count on when she decided to mess with Thompson family legacy. My grandfather wasn't just meticulous about paperwork, he was paranoid about protecting what was his, and sometimes paranoia pays off in ways you never expect. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that document with my grandfather's signature, the way Patricia had smiled when she showed it to me, and the sinking feeling that something wasn't right. At 3 o'clock in the morning, I gave up on sleep and headed down to the basement where my grandfather had kept all his important papers in a series of metal filing cabinets that he'd organized with military precision. If there was any truth to Patricia's claims, or more importantly, any evidence to contradict them, it would be down here among the decades of carefully preserved documents. The basement smelled like old paper and my grandfather's pipe tobacco, a comforting scent that reminded me of summer afternoons when he'd teach me about property lines and the importance of keeping good records. I spent the next 6 hours going through every file, every folder, every scrap of paper that mentioned our property. What I found was a goldmine of documentation that proved beyond any doubt that my grandfather had never signed any agreement with anyone about giving up development rights to our lakefront. There were surveys from the 1962nd property tax records going back 50 years, and most importantly, a copy of my grandfather's will that specifically stated that the entire 15-acre parcel, including all lakefront access, was to remain in the Thompson family in perpetuity without exception or inclusion. But the real bombshell was a folder labeled HOA correspondence that contained letters from my grandfather to various city officials, documenting his suspicions about corruption in the local planning department and his concerns about what he called suspicious development approvals in our area. Armed with this evidence, I marched back to Patricia's house the next morning, only to find her standing in my driveway with 2 security guards and a man in a cheap suit who introduced himself as a county code enforcement officer. While I'd been digging through family documents, Patricia had been busy filing complaints about unauthorized structures on my property, claiming that my grandfather's old workshop violated current building codes and posed a safety hazard to the code enforcement officer, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, handed me a citation requiring the immediate removal of the workshop and threatening daily fines if I didn't comply within 72 hours. This is harassment, I told Patricia, waving the citation in her face. You can't just make up violations because you don't like what I found in my grandfather's papers. But Patricia just smiled that infuriating smile and adjusted her plastic tiara, which she was apparently wearing as a regular accessory. Now as to Thompson, she said, her voice dripping with mock concern. I'm simply ensuring that all residents of Lakeside Estates comply with community standards. If you have issues with county enforcement, perhaps you should talk that up with the appropriate authorities. She gestured to her security guards, 2 massive men wearing matching black polo shirts with Harrington security embroidered on the chest, who had positioned themselves around my property like they were guarding Fort Knox, instead of a retirement community in suburban Michigan. That's when I decided to dig deeper into Patricia's background and her rise to power in Lakeside Estates. What I discovered made my blood run cold. Through some careful internet research and a few phone calls to Pharmacity employees, I learned that Patricia had donated substantial amounts of money to several local political campaigns the past few years, including the current mayor and 3 of the 5 city council members. More disturbing, I found records showing that the same code enforcement officer who cited me had received a consulting fee from Patricia's late husband's construction company just 6 months before her husband's mysterious disappearance. The paper trail was thin, but it was there, hidden in public records that most people would never think to check. But real breakthrough came when I was reading through the fine print of the original HOA charter, looking for any loopholes that might help my case. Buried deep in Section 47G subsection 12 was a clause that I'd never seen mentioned in any of the HOA literature that Patricia distributed. It stated that any major development project on disputed land within the community boundaries required a full environmental assessment before construction could begin. Not only that, but if any resident challenged the ownership of the land in question, all development had to cease until the ownership dispute was resolved through proper legal channels. This wasn't just a bureaucratic requirement, it was my lifeline. The next morning, I called the county environmental office and requested a formal assessment of the lakefront area where Patricia wanted to build her mansion. The woman on the phone seemed surprised that anyone was asking for an environmental review in Lakeside Estates, but she scheduled an inspector to come out the following week. When I told Patricia about the environmentalist instant's requirement, went from calm and collected to absolutely furious in about 3 seconds. You have no right to interfere with legally approved construction, she snarled, her plastic tiara slightly askew from her agitation. I'll have you arrested for harassment and obstruction of commerce. But for the first time since this whole mess started, I had the law on my side, and we both knew it. What I didn't know was that requesting that environmental assessment would be the key that unlocked a horror story that would make Patricia's land grab look like a parking ticket. The environmental inspector arrived the following Tuesday morning, and his name was Dr. James Patterson, a soft-spoken man in his 50s who looked like he'd spent more time in laboratories and courtrooms. He carried a briefcase full of testing equipment and had the kind of methodical approach that I immediately appreciated, probably because it reminded me of my grandfather's attention to detail. Dr. Patterson explained that he would need to take soil and water samples from various points around the Lakefront area, test for contamination levels, and assess whether the proposed construction would impact the local ecosystem. What should have been a routine environmental check was about to become something much more sinister. While Dr. Patterson set up his equipment near the lake, I noticed Patricia watching us from her house through a pair of binoculars, occasionally speaking into her phone with animated gestures. Something about her behavior struck me as more frantic than usual, as if the environmental assessment was causing her genuine panic rather than just annoyance. I mentioned this to Dr. Patterson, who nodded thoughtfully and suggested we expand the testing area to include the community garden that Patricia had established 2 years ago as one of her neighborhood beautification projects. The garden was located about 100 yards from the proposed construction site, and Patricia had always been extremely proud of it, frequently bragging about her all-natural organic growing methods that produced the most Amazon vegetables anyone had ever seen. The first red flag came when Dr. Patterson started testing the soil composition near the community garden. His portable analyzer started beeping in a way that made him frown and run the test again. "That's odd," he muttered, adjusting his glasses and checking the readout. "The nitrogen levels in this soil are off the equation, almost 3 times higher than what you'd expect from normal composting or fertilizer use." He took several more samples from different areas of the garden, and each one showed the same abnormally high nitrogen content. More concerning was the presence of phosphorus compounds that typically indicated the decomposition of organic matter, but not the kind of organic matter you'd expect to find in a vegetable garden. When I asked Dr. Patterson what could cause such unusual readings, he explained that extremely high nitrogen and phosphorus levels usually indicated the presence of large amounts of decomposing proteinric material in agricultural settings. "This might come from animal waste or bone meal fertilizer," he said, "but the concentrations here are more consistent with what you'd find in areas where large animals had died and decomposed or where significant amounts of organic waste had been buried." The way he said it with that careful scientific precision made my stomach turn. I started thinking about Patricia's mysterious late husband and his convenient disappearance, and suddenly the community garden didn't seem like such an innocent hobby project. That afternoon, while Dr. Patterson continued his testing, I decided to pay a visit to Maggie Sullivan, a long-time Lakeside Estates resident who had been one of the few people willing to openly question Patricia's increasingly authoritarian leadership style. Maggie was a retired teacher in her 70s, with sharp blue eyes and a no-nonsense attitude that had probably terrified generations of middle school students. She lived 3 houses down from Patricia and had been keeping detailed notes about the strange comings and goings at the Harrington residence ever since Patricia's husband disappeared. What Maggie told me over coffee and homemade cookies made my blood run cold. "Richard Harrington was a nice enough man," Maggie said, stirring sugar into her coffee with deliberate movements. "But he had started asking questions about Patricia's finances and her spending habits. He'd come over here sometimes looking worried, talking about how Patricia was obsessed with controlling everything and everyone around her. The last time I saw him, about 3 days before he supposedly left for Europe, he told me he was thinking about filing for divorce because he'd discovered some disturbing things about Patricia's past." Maggie paused, looking out the window toward Patricia's house. "The funny thing is, Richard never mentioned any European vocation to me, and he was the type of man who would have talked about a trip like that 4 months in advance. He loved to travel, loved to plan every detail of his trips." But the most chilling part of Maggie's story came when she described the changes in Patricia's behavior after Richard's disappearance. "She started that community garden project almost immediately after Richard left," Maggie explained. "She was out there at all hours, day and night, digging and planting and working with this organic fertilizer that she claimed to make herself. The smell was terrible, especially in the summer, but Patricia insisted it was just part of the composting process. She wouldn't let anyone else help with the garden maintenance. Said she had 2 personnel supervise every aspect of the growing, the process to maintain the organic integrity." As Maggie continued her story, she mentioned something that made me nearly choke on my coffee. About 6 months after the garden was established, several other residents had complained about people going missing from the community, mostly individuals who had publicly disagreed with Patricia's policies or questioned her authority. There was Mrs. Henderson from Oak Street, who complained about Patricia's new parking restrictions, Maggie said, counting on her fingers, and Tom Bradley, who questioned the HOA budget allocations at a community meeting, and Sarah Kim, who tried to organize a petition to limit Patricia's power as president. All of them just disappeared within a few months of crossing Patricia, and all of them supposedly moved away suddenly for various family emergencies or job opportunities. When I left Maggie's house that evening, my mind was reeling with the implications of what I'd learned. The high nitrogen levels, the missing residents, the mysterious disappearance of Patricia's husband, and the timing of the community garden project all pointed to something far more sinister than a simple land grab. As I walked across my property toward the house, I noticed Patricia standing in her garden, illuminated by spotlights she'd installed around the perimeter, working with a shovel and what looked like bags of fresh soil. And that's when I received a phone call from Jake Morrison that would change everything. Jake Morrison had been my best friend since college, and after graduation, he'd gone into private investigation while I pursued environmental engineering. Jake was the kind of guy who I could find a needle in a haystack and then figure out who put it there and why. When his voice came through my phone that evening, shaky and urgent, I knew something big was about to break open. "Marcus, I need you to sit down for this," he said without any preamble. "I've been doing some digging into Patricia Harrington's background, like I asked, and what I found is going to blow your mind. We're not just talking about a land grab here. We're talking about something that makes serial killers look like shoplifters." Jake had started his investigation by looking into Patricia's financial records and the circumstances surrounding her husband's disappearance. But what he discovered was a pattern that stretched back years and involved multiple missing persons cases across 3 different states. "I cross-referenced missing persons reports with Patricia's previous addresses," Jake explained, his voice taking on that clinical tone he used when discussing particularly disturbing cases. "Every place people have disappeared. Not just 1 or 2 people, Marcus, were dozens. People who disagreed with her, people who got in her way, people who simply knew too much about her business dealings." The pattern was consistent and terrifying. Patricia would move into a community, quickly establish herself in a position of authority, and then anyone who challenged her would mysteriously vanish. But the real breakthrough came when Jake started investigating the chemical purchases Patricia had been making over the past few years. Through his contacts at various chemical supply companies, he discovered that Patricia had been buying industrial-grade cleaning agents, lime and other materials commonly used for body disposal. "The quantities are massive," Marcus Jake continued. "We're talking about enough chemicals to clean up after a small army, and she's been purchasing them regularly every few months for the past 3 years. Even more disturbing was timing of these purchases, which consistently occurred within weeks of local missing persons reports being filed." The conversation took an even darker turn when Jake mentioned his discovery about Patricia's previous. As a lawyer, she hadn't just been any lawyer. She'd specialized in estate planning and probate law, which means she knew exactly how to make people disappear from a legal standpoint as well as a physical one. She's been forging wills, transferring assets, and manipulating estate documents to make it look like these missing people voluntarily gave her their property before disappearing, Jake explained. "She's not just a killer, Marcus. She's been running a sophisticated long-term fraud operation that uses murder as a business tool." While Jake was delivering this bombshell information, I was watching Patricia through my kitchen window, and what I saw made my blood freeze. She was in her community garden again, but this time, she wasn't alone. She had 2 men with her, both wearing the same black polo shirts as her security guards, and they were carefully excavating a section of the garden that had been marked off with yellow tape. As I watched, one of the men pulled at something long and white from the soil, something that looked suspiciously like a human femur bone. Patricia examined its object carefully, said something to the men that made them nod grimly, and then all 3 of them began working to bury it again in a different location. The next morning, Maggie Sullivan called me with news that confirmed my worst fears. She had been secretly taking soil samples from Patricia's community garden for the past several weeks. Motivated by the terrible smell and her suspicions about the missing residents, working with a friend who had connections at Delco University's forensics lab, Maggie had managed to get the samples tested for DNA evidence. "Marcus, you need to hear this," Maggie said, her normally steady voice trembling with shock. "The lab found human DNA in every single sample I collected. Not just trace amounts, but significant concentrations that indicate the presence of decomposing remains throughout the entire garden area." But Maggie's investigation had uncovered something even more horrifying. The DNA testing had identified genetic material from at least 5 different individuals, including a positive match for Richard Harrington, Patricia's supposedly traveling husband. "Richard never went to Europe," Maggie said quietly. "He's been fertilizing Patricia's prize-winning tomatoes for the past 3 years. The laboratory results also showed traces of DNA that matched missing persons reports for 3 of the other disappeared Lakeside Estates residents, confirming that Patricia had been systematically murdered anyone who stood in her way and using their remains to create what she proudly called her organical natural fertilizer." The most chilling aspect of Patricia's operation was the sheer audacity of it. She had been hosting community garden tours, selling her vegetables at local farmers markets, and even donating produce to the local food bank, all while growing her crops in soil enriched with the decomposed remains of her victims. The community garden that she used as a symbol of her environmental consciousness and community leadership was a mass grave disguised as a neighborhood amenity. Every time she bragged about her gardening success, every time she handed out vegetables, tonaburs, every time she posed for photos with her prize-winning produce, she was essentially displaying her victims as trophies. That evening, as I was processing the full horror of what Maggie and Jake had discovered, I received an anonymous note slipped under my front door, written in block letters that looked like they'd been carefully disguised. The message was simple and terrifying. Accidents can happen, Tonya and Mr. Thompson. Even environmental engineers who ask too many questions, stop digging, or you'll find yourself planted permanently. The threat was clear, but it also confirmed that Patricia knew exactly what we'd discovered and was prepared to add me to her garden's fertilizer collection if I didn't back down. But Patricia had made one crucial mistake in her threat. She assumed that I would be intimidated and to stop investigating, that I would value my safety over justice for her victims. What she didn't realize was that the environmental assessment she'd been so worried about was about to provide Dr. Sarah Mitchell with the evidence she needed to turn Patricia's gardening hobby into a criminal case that would make national. Dr. Sarah Mitchell arrived at my house the next morning looking like she'd rather be anywhere else in the world. As the county's chief forensic pathologist, she'd seen her share of disturbing cases, but the preliminary lab results from our environmental samples had shaken her professional composure. She was a woman in her early 40s with graying hair pulled back in a severe bun, and the kind of intense focus that comes from years of working with evidence that could make or break criminal cases. Mr. Thompson, she said, setting her briefcase down on my kitchen table with deliberate care, what we've discovered in your neighborhood goes far beyond environmental contamination. We're looking at what appears to be a systematic disposal operation that's been running for years. Dr. Mitchell opened her briefcase and spread out a series of laboratory reports, DNA analysis charts, and photographs that made my stomach lurch. The forensic evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. The soil samples from Patricia's community garden contained genetic material from at least 7 different individuals, including Richard Harrington and 4 of the missing Lakeside Estates residents that Maggie had mentioned. But the most disturbing was that the DNA evidence suggested the bodies had been processed, not just buried. These remains show signs of deliberate dismemberment and chemical treatment, Dr. Mitchell explained, pointing to specific data points on her charts. This wasn't the work of someone who killed in a moment of passion and panicked about disposal. This was methodical, planned, and executed with the kind of knowledge that suggests medical or anatomical training. The forensic analysis had also revealed something that made the entire operation even more sinister. Patricia had been harnessing a sophisticated composting system that accelerated decomposition while preserving certain organic compounds that would enhance plant growth. She's been running what amounts to a human rendering operation disguised as an farming project, Dr. Mitchell said, her voice taking on the clinical tone that medical professionals use when discussing the unthinkable. The chemical composition of the soil suggests she's been using lime, sulfuric acid, and other industrial agents to break down tissue while retaining the nitrogen and phosphorus compounds that would benefit plant growth. It's scientifically brilliant and morally horrifying. While Dr. Mitchell was explaining the technical aspects of Patricia's operation, my phone started buzzing with text messages from other Lakeside Estates residents. Word was getting out about the investigation, and Patricia had gone into full damage control mode. According to the messages, she was hosting an emergency HOA meeting, telling everyone that I was suffering from a stress-induced mental breakdown brought on by the pressure of inheriting family property, and that my wild accusations were the result of paranoid delusions and environmental. She was even claiming that I had planted false evidence in her garden as part of an elaborate scheme to discredit her and steal community property for my development purposes. But Patricia's attempt to control the narrative backfired spectacularly when several residents started sharing their suspicions and concerns about the missing community members. Tom Bradley's wife came forward with information Abatho Patricia had pressured Tom to sign over his property interest just days before his disappearance. Mrs. Henderson's daughter revealed that her mother had been documenting Patricia's financial irregularities and had planned to present evidence of embezzlement at the next HOA meeting before she vanished. Sarah Kim's husband admitted that his wife had discovered Patricia was using HOA funds to pay for personal expenses and had been planning to file a formal complaint with the state attorney general's office. The situation escalated dramatically when the county sheriff's department arrived with a search warrant for Patricia's property, and Dr. Mitchell had presented the DNA evidence to the district attorney's office. And within hours, law enforcement had mobilized a full forensic investigation team. As patrol cars surrounded Patricia's house and crime scene technicians began setting up equipment around the community garden, Patricia emerged from her front door, wearing her plastic tiara and carrying what appeared to be a gasoline can and a stack of papers. She was planning to destroy evidence, but the sight of law enforcement vehicles had caught her off guard. What happened next was both terrifying and oddly satisfying. Patricia tried to run back into her house to burn whatever documents she was carrying, but she was intercepted by who tackled her on her front lawn as she struggled against the handcuffs, screaming about her rights and demanding to speak to her lawyer. The gasoline can spilled across her driveway, soaking the papers she'd been trying to destroy. When the forensic team retrieved the soggy documents, they discovered detailed records of Patricia's victims, including dates of death, methods of disposal, and financial information about the assets she'd stolen from each person. But the real bombshell came when the forensic team began excavating the community garden with ground-penetrating radar and cadaver dogs. Within 2 hours, they had located not just 5 burial sites, but 8, including one that contained the remains of Patricia's first husband from her previous marriage in Ohio, a man who had supposedly died in a boating accident 5 years earlier. The methodical way the bodies had been arranged and processed suggested that Patricia had been perfecting her disposal technique over time, learning from each murder how to more efficiently convert human remains into garden fertilizer. As these set over Lakeside Estates that evening, Patricia Harrington sat in the back of a patrol car, no longer wearing a ridiculous tiara, staring at the excavation site that had once been her pride and joy, the community garden that she had used to demonstrate her environmental consciousness and community leadership had become a crime scene that would require months to fully process. But even as she faced the overwhelming evidence of her crimes, Patricia maintained her defiant attitude, telling anyone who would listen that she was the victim of a conspiracy orchestrated by jealous neighbors and incompetent law enforcement. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for the following week, but none of us were prepared for what Patricia would try to pull in that courtroom or how the 5 minutes that followed would finally bring justice to her victims. The courthouse was packed on the morning of Patricia's preliminary hearing with news, crews, curious residents, and family members of the victims filling every available seat. Judge William Crawford, a stern man in his 60s with a reputation for running a nonsense courtroom, had already made it clear that he wouldn't tolerate any theatrical displays or emotional outbursts during the proceedings. Patricia sat at the defendant's table wearing an orange jumpsuit instead of her usual designer clothes, but somehow managed to smuggle in a smaller version of a plastic tiara which she wore with the same defiant pride that had characterized her reign of terror in Lakeside Estates. Her lawyer, a slick-talking defense attorney named Robert Cosnos, had flown in from Chicago and was already working to create reasonable doubt about the overwhelming evidence against his client. The prosecution's case seemed airtight. DNA evidence from 8 different victims, financial records showing systematic fraud, and witness testimony from multiple residents who had seen Patricia's suspicious behavior over the years. District Attorney Jennifer Walsh had laid out the charges methodically, painting a picture of a serial killer who had used her position as HOA president to identify, murder, and dispose of anyone who threatened her control over the community. Evidence was so overwhelming that most observers expected Patricia to accept a plea bargain, but she had other plans. As the hearing progressed, it became clear that Patricia genuinely believed she could manipulate the legal system just as effectively as she had manipulated her neighbors for years. Castano started his defense by attacking the credibility of the DNA evidence, claiming that these samples had been contaminated and that the forensic analysis was flawed. He suggested that the bodies found in the community garden were the remains of homeless individuals or drifters who had died of natural causes and been improperly buried by previous property owners. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, gesturing dramatically toward the jury, "my client is a pillar of the community, a woman who dedicated her life to improving the lives of her neighbors. The prosecution wants you to believe that this environmentally conscious leader somehow became a master criminal. But where is the motive? Where is the evidence of premeditation? All we have are coincidences and contaminated soil samples." But the defense strategy took a more sinister turn when Castanos began attacking my credibility directly. He claimed that I had planted the DNA evidence in Patricia's garden as part of an elaborate scheme to frame her for murder and steal her property. Marcus Thompson had the means, the motive, and the opportunity to contaminate those soil samples, Castellanos argued, pulling out a folder of documents that he claimed proved I had been planning to develop the Lakefront property for commercial purposes. He's an environmental engineer with access to laboratory equipment and chemical agents. He's also the sole beneficiary of a family property that would be worth millions if he could eliminate the HOA restrictions that prevent commercial development. The courtroom erupted when Castellanos presented what he claimed was evidence that I had been researching human decomposition and soil contamination for months before the investigation began. He had somehow obtained my internet search history, which showed queries about DNA degradation, soil chemistry, and forensic investigation techniques, all of which he claimed proved that I knew necessary to plant false evidence. Patricia sat at the defendant's table, nodding along with her lawyer's accusations, occasionally shooting me venomous glares that made it clear she still believed she could escape justice by destroying my reputation. That's when I decided it was time to reveal the scythe that my grandfather had inadvertently left me 30 years ago. I stood up in the courtroom, much to Judge Crawford's pleas, and requested permission to present additional evidence that I had been saving for exactly this moment. "Your Honor," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. "I have video and audio evidence that will definitively prove Patricia Harrington's guilt and expose the lies that her defense attorney is telling this court." Judge Crawford looked skeptical, but he allowed me to approach the bench with Dr. Mitchell and Jake Morrison, who had been coordinating with law enforcement to prepare for this exact scenario. The evidence I presented was a collection of digital recordings from a sophisticated surveillance system that my grandfather had installed on our property in the early 1992. Long before such technology became, Grandpa Thompson had been paranoid about property theft and had invested in state-of-the-art recording equipment he'd hidden throughout the ranch, including several cameras with clear sightlines to what would eventually become Patricia's community garden. The system had been recording continuously for over 30 years, capturing thousands of hours of footage that documented everything that had happened on and around our property. But real bombshell was the advanced voice recording technology that my grandfather had incorporated into his surveillance system using early AI voice recognition software that he'd obtained through his connections in the military industry. The system had been programmed to activate whenever it detected human voices in specific areas off the property. Over the years, it had recorded dozens of conversations, including several chilling exchanges between Patricia and her victims in the moments before their deaths. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Crawford reviewed the evidence with the prosecution and defense teams. The recordings were unambiguous. Patricia's voice could be heard threatening her victims, describing in detail how she planned to kill them and dispose of their bodies, and even bragging about previous murders that she had gotten away with. On a particularly damning recording from 2 years ago, Patricia could be heard telling her husband Richard that she was going to plant him in the garden with the others because he had discovered her financial crimes and was threatening her to the authorities. Here came the 5 minutes that would define everything. Judge Crawford returned to his bench and announced that he would play the most relevant recordings for the court. As the first audio clip began to play, Patricia's confident demeanor crumbled completely. The voice coming through the courtroom speakers wasn't mistakenly hers, cold and calculating as she described her plans to murder Mrs. Henderson and used her remains to fertilize the tomato plants. "She thinks she can challenge my authority," Patricia's recorded voice said with chilling clarity, "but she'll make excellent compost for next season's harvest." By the second minute, Patricia was shaking visibly, her plastic tiara askew and her orange jumpsuit stained with sweat. The second recording captured her conversation with Tom Bradley as she forced him to sign over his property deeds before strangling him with a garden hose. By the third minute, Patricia was sobbing uncontrollably as her own voice described the perfect system she had developed for processing human remains into organic fertilizer. The fourth minute brought recordings of her planning Sarah Kim's murder, discussing the best methods for accelerating decomposition and laughing about how the community praised her gardening skills. But it was the fifth minute that broke Patricia completely. The final recording captured her conversation with Richard Harrington, her husband, as she explained that his death would be just another unfortunate accident and that his body would contribute to the community garden. "That will be my lasting legacy." As her husband's terrified pleas for mercy filled the courtroom, Patricia stood up and screamed at the judge, "That land destroyed my life. Everything I built, everything I accomplished, it all came from that cursed property." Her confession continued as courthouse security moved to restrain her, detailing crimes that spanned multiple states and involved at least 15 additional victims. The courtroom erupted into chaos as Patricia's complete breakdown revealed the true scope of her crimes. But Judge Crawford's gavel brought order back to the proceedings. In less than 5 minutes, the surveillance evidence that my grandfather had unknowingly preserved had transformed a complex murder case into an open and shut conviction that would ensure Patricia Harrington would never hurt anyone again. The aftermath of Patricia's courtroom breakdown was swift and devastating for her carefully constructed empire of lies. Within hours of her confession, FBI agents had arrived in Lakeside Estates to coordinate with local law enforcement in what was now being classified as a multi-state serial killing investigation. Patricia's admission to 15 additional murders had triggered a nationwide manhunt for evidence, with forensic teams dispatched to every location where she had previously lived. The woman who had once ruled our community with an iron fist and a plastic tiara was now facing multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole, and her reign of terror was finally over. Judge Crawford had immediately remanded Patricia to federal custody pending a comprehensive psychological evaluation and the coordination of charges across multiple jurisdictions. The courtroom had been cleared after her breakdown, but not. News crews had captured every moment of her confession for broadcast across the country. Within 24 hours, Patricia Harrington had become the face of suburban evil, a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power in residential communities. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that a woman who had spent years obsessing over property values and community standards had single-handedly destroyed the reputation of Lakeside Estates forever. Fine investigation into Patricia's other victims revealed the true scope of her criminal enterprise and the sophisticated methods she had developed over nearly 2 decades of killing. FBI forensic accountants discovered that Shah had stolen over $2–3 million in assets from her victims through forged wills, fraudulent property transfers, and elaborate estate planning schemes. She had been operating what amounted to amateur for-profit business model, systematically targeting wealthy individuals who lived alone and had minimal family connections. The community garden and lakeside estates hadn't been her first disposal site. Investigators found evidence of similar operations in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Florida, each disguised as environmentally conscious neighborhood improvement projects. One of the most disturbing aspects of the investigation was discovering how Patricia had manipulated local governments and community organizations to facilitate her crimes. In Ohio, she had convinced the city council to approve a beauty grant that funded her garden project while providing legal cover for the extensive digging and soil modification required for body disposal. In Pennsylvania, she had established herself as a respected member of the Historical Preservation Society, using her position to access old cemetery records and forge death certificates for her victims. Each location showing the same pattern. Patricia would arrive, establish credibility through community involvement, identify vulnerabilities, and then systematically eliminate anyone who posed a threat to her operation. But perhaps the most chilling discovery came when investigators examined Patricia's personal effects and found detailed journals documenting her crimes. She had kept meticulous records of each murder, including photographs of her victims' before and after death, detailed notes about decomposition rates and soil improvement, and even customer feedback from people who had purchased vegetables grown in her human fertilizer. The journals revealed a woman who genuinely believed she was providing a valuable service to her communities, turning problematic individuals into productive entrants through what she called organic recycling. The psychological evaluation later confirmed that Patricia suffered from a rare form of narcissistic personality disorder combined with sociopathic tendencies had made her incapable of recognizing the humanity of her victims. The legal proceedings moved quickly once Patricia's mental competency was established. Despite her defense team's attempts to argue for insanity, the detailed planning and sophisticated execution of her crimes demonstrated clear premeditation and awareness of their illegality. The wealth of evidence from my grandfather's surveillance system, combined with the DNA findings and Patricia's confession, made the prosecution's case unassailable. She was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole on 17 counts of first-degree murder, along with additional sentences for fraud, conspiracy, and desecration of human remains. The judge's final words to Patricia were particularly memorable. "You have forfeited your right to exist among civilized human beings." During the sentencing hearing, Patricia made one final attempt to justify her actions, delivering a rambling speech community improvement and natural resource management that demonstrated her complete lack of remorse or understanding of the magnitude of her crimes. "I created something beautiful," she insisted, speaking directly to Judge Crawford. Despite her lawyer's attempts to silence her, those gardens fed families, brought communities together, and improved property values for everyone. The people I recycled were contributing to something greater than themselves for the first time in their miserable lives. Her words sent chills through the courtroom and sealed any remaining doubts about her guilt or sanity. The ripple effects of Patricia's crimes extended far beyond the immediate victims and their families. Property values in the former lakeside estates plummeted by over 60% as news of the murders spread, forcing many innocent residents into financial ruin. Real estate agents began referring to the area as cursed land, and several families abandoned their homes entirely rather than continue living in a place associated with such horror. The local farming community also suffered as consumers became suspicious of organics and community gardens throughout the region, leading to significant economic losses for legitimate agricultural businesses. The civil proceedings that followed Patricia's conviction were almost as dramatic as criminal trial. The families of her victims filed wrongful death lawsuits seeking damages from Patricia's estate, which included not only her lakeside estate's mansion but also property she had stolen from previous victims across multiple states. The total value of recoverable assets exceeded $4 million, providing some financial compensation for the families whose loved ones had been lost to Patricia's greed and madness. My family's ranch was finally returned to us without question, along with a formal apology from the Lakeside Estates HOA board for their role in enabling Patricia's schemes. But the most satisfying twist came in Patricia's final letter discovered in her cell 3 months after her sentencing, written in the same meticulous handwriting that had characterized her garden journals. The letter was a detailed confession to crimes that law enforcement hadn't even. She described 15 additional murders spanning back to her college years, including her first kill, a roommate who had threatened to report Patricia's academic dishonesty. The letter revealed that Patricia's compulse to kill had started early and evolved over time into the sophisticated operation that had terrorized multiple. The letter also contained Patricia's twisted attempt at creating a legacy with detailed instructions for their potential killers on how to establish themselves in residential communities and identify the blog victims. Fortunately, law enforcement to intercepted the letter before Patricia could find a way to distribute it, preventing her from inspiring copycat crimes. The FBI used the information to solve cold cases dating back 25 years, bringing closure to families who had never known what happened to their missing loved ones. Today, the former site of Patricia's mansion has been converted into a memorial garden for her victims, maintained by volunteers from the redesigned community now called Peaceful Gardens. The HOA has been dissolved, replaced by an association with strictly limited powers and transparent financial oversight. My family's ranch remains in Thompson's hands, protected by ironclad legal documents and a security system that my grandfather would have been proud of. And somewhere in a federal prison, Patricia Harrington spends her days in solitary confinement, finally powerless to hurt anyone else. Sometimes the people we trust most are the one escapable of the greatest evil, but the truth always has a way of surfacing when we're brave enough to dig for it. If you like this story, don't forget to like and subscribe Alex Stories.